Last week, 5 of the 6 scheduled hearings were held regarding the case of Metropolitan Arseniy, and a 7th was held on Saturday, December 6th. On Monday, the hearing regarding the recusal of the state prosecutor was terminated because of the judge's own recusal. The appellate court postponed the hearing of Metropolitan Arseniy's appeal of the decision to keep him imprisoned and deny the possibility of bail for the most recent criminal charges of disinformation. The appellate court has yet to hold the first hearing in this appeal. Twice already it's been postponed. They justify this delay because they apparently haven't received the case files from the initial court decision back on November 3rd. This seems unusual, though, being that other courts have always quickly and promptly received the necessary files to continue prosecuting Metropolitan Arseniy, as we shall shortly see. Back on November 3rd, the court ruled that Metropolitan Arseniy should be detained until December 10th. As it happens, Metropolitan Arseniy's pretrial detention has now been routinely extended again before the first hearing of this appeal was heard. This is the 10th time Metropolitan Arseniy's detention in prison has been extended. It's worth noting that between June 22nd and August 15th of 2024, a period of almost 2 months, Metropolitan Arseniy was held in prison without a valid court order extending the pretrial detention, and then again this happened from July 22nd to August 1st, 2025. Also on September 29th, 2025, while the recusal of the judge in the case, Tatiana Anatolievna Haustova, was being considered, she, that is, Tatiana, sent a letter to the prison extending the detention of Metropolitan Arseniy for another 60 days. These are examples of the grievous violations of our bishop's rights and legal protocol. Accordingly, Metropolitan Arseniy should be released immediately. On December 4th, the feast of the presentation of the Theotokos into the temple, the court opened the proceedings at noon, but delayed them until 4 p.m. because Metropolitan Arseniy's lawyers were unable to connect remotely due to a scheduled electrical outage. At 4:30, the judge announced that the video connection was still inoperable and moved the hearing to the next day. Metropolitan Arseniy requested that the judge not schedule the hearing for the 5th, or at least delay it until after lunch, so that he could serve liturgy in the detention facility. Because December 5th was the 20th anniversary of his enthronement as the bishop of the Svятihirsk Lavra. Judge Tatiana Bezruk denied the request, stating that the prosecutor's petition to extend the pretrial detention needed to be addressed within 72 hours of its filing. However, according to Metropolitan Arseniy's lawyers, this is only the case for initial orders of detention for someone who has just been arrested, and not someone already being detained. Metropolitan Arseniy's legal team have stated that the court's quick accommodation of the prosecution's petitions and the delay in addressing the defenses shows a clear bias in the state's treatment of Metropolitan Arseniy. On December 5th, the hearing began at 10 o'clock. At 12:40, a recess was called to allow government officials to connect remotely. These are members of the Ukrainian parliament who are willing to take on personal responsibility for Metropolitan Arseniy's release on bail. After the conclusion of the recess, without any explanation, none of the members of parliament had been connected. Only Member of Parliament Victoria Grib, who came in person, was able to participate in the hearing. Also, Metropolitan Arseniy's legal team was not connected by the court to participate in the hearing. Because of this, a public defender was appointed by the court for the proceeding. Upon arriving, the public defender was given an hour and a half to familiarize himself with the case. That's half the time that is allotted by law. Besides this, the prosecutor presented him with the case documents, not the judge. Because of these and other procedural violations, the public defender challenged the judge's impartiality. I believe what that means is that he declared a mistrial. His objection was considered by Judge Anastasia Igorovna Privalikhina, without the knowledge of any of the participants in the case, which is another legal procedural violation. As reported by the Svятihirsk press service, quote, "The consideration of the recusal of the judge was formal and was conducted very quickly," end quote. The court rejected the petition of recusal. Following this, the hearing continued, and one of Metropolitan Arseniy's lawyers was connected via video conference. Finally, due to the allegations of egregious procedural violations, the court hearing was adjourned until 10 a.m. Saturday, December 6th. Metropolitan Arseniy was returned that evening to the detention facility after nearly 11 hours of being in the courtroom. We will remind you that his health is continuing to deteriorate, and he is in need of emergency surgery on his heart, as established by multiple doctors on multiple occasions, while the court continually refuses to allow him the necessary medical care. So the hearing on Saturday was interesting. According to the Sviatokirsk Lavra press service, initially the staff at the court said they wouldn't allow anyone in to attend the hearing as listeners because the court was closed on Saturday, unless the judge allowed it. The judge did allow this, but limited the number of listeners by the amount of seats in the courtroom. Next, Metropolitan Arseniy's entire legal team was prepared to connect remotely. We'll remind you that the adjudicating court is located very close to the front lines and has refused to transfer the case to another region, whereas most of the lawyers defending Metropolitan Arseniy live in Kiev. Still, even before the hearing began, a public defender, different from the one appointed on Friday, was present in the courtroom with the expectation of representing Metropolitan Arseniy. Now, I'm no legal expert, but the general practice, to my understanding, is to appoint a public defender in a situation when a person has no other legal representation. None of Metropolitan Arseniy's lawyers were connected or allowed to participate in the hearing, and of course there was a justification that was given for this. Once again, none of the 9 members of parliament were connected that have publicly expressed their willingness to take responsibility for Metropolitan Arseniy's release during the remainder of the trial. The public defender was not acquainted in the slightest with Metropolitan Arseniy's case. In fact, she wasn't even informed by the court that he has private legal counsel. Nonetheless, for whatever reason, innocent or malicious, the public defender refused to contact Metropolitan Arseniy's private legal counsel, another procedural and legal violation, to discuss with them how to proceed, and stated she was able and willing to participate in the hearing. Now, we won't take your time covering every procedural and legal violation that occurred on Saturday, but there is one more episode that is worth recounting. During the hearing, the judge stated that Metropolitan Arseniy had called his lawyers while in the courtroom. He said that this is impossible because he doesn't have a phone, as can be attested by the many people in the courtroom and the security personnel that brought him to the court that morning. His phone, of course, was confiscated nearly 20 months ago upon initial arrest. Once again, Metropolitan Arseniy requested that his lawyers be allowed to participate in the hearing, but Judge Tatyana Vasilyevna Bezruk ignored this request. At this point, Metropolitan Arseniy motioned to have the judge recused. This motion was quickly resolved, though. Notwithstanding that it was a weekend and the court was closed, there just happened to be another judge in the building who determined that recusal was not warranted. Upon returning to the courtroom, Judge Tatyana informed Vladika Arseniy that if he were to bring up any other alleged violations of his legal rights, he would be removed from the courtroom. I mean, you can't make this up, right? If you exercise your legal rights to defend yourself again, I will have you removed from my courtroom. By the end of the hearing, Metropolitan Arseniy's pretrial detention was again extended for 60 days, until February 3rd, 2026. The state prosecutor justified this, among other things, because of the alleged authority and material resources of the Metropolitan, by which he could pressure witnesses if he were released. We again ask that you continue to pray for the health and strength of the servant of God, Metropolitan Arseniy, and that he be quickly released from his captivity. And those that have the power to do so, intervene in the case of Vladika Arseniy before it is too late. Now, as regarding the recent comments of U.S. representatives about the Orthodox churches in America. On December 18th, a group of hierarchs from multiple canonical jurisdictions, among them the Serbian, Antiochian Orthodox churches, and the Orthodox Church of America, and ROCOR, attended meetings in Washington, D.C. to advocate for the persecuted Ukrainian Orthodox Church, a good example of which is the case of Metropolitan Arseniy. One of the representatives contacted to meet with this delegation was Representative Joe Wilson, who sits on the House Committee of Foreign Affairs. His response was to accuse Orthodox churches in America with, quote, ties to Moscow, end quote, of acting as agents of Russian intelligence. This caused quite a bit of uneasiness among all Orthodox Christians in America, as Representative Wilson's comments could easily be interpreted as referring to any Orthodox church. But this lack of clarity on Representative Wilson's part was recognized by him because he made multiple follow-up posts on X clarifying that his comments only pertain to the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, ROCOR, and not to any other Orthodox Christian jurisdictions. He said, quote, "My comments pertain only to the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, operating under the umbrella of the Moscow Patriarchate. Most Orthodox churches are not affiliated with Moscow," end quote. In another post, he wrote, quote, "I completely agree with Thomas Beach. The Orthodox Church in America, the OCA, leads by example. They are self-governing, autocephalic. I believe the word he meant to say is autocephalous, from the Greek autokephalia, self-headed, right, self-governing. But we are trying to be vigorous and upright, so we'll take it as a compliment." As he was saying, the OCA is self-governing from the Moscow Patriarchate and aligned with Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, end quote. Now, this is an interesting statement because the Ecumenical Patriarch doesn't recognize the autocephaly of the Orthodox Church in America. One might ask if Joe Wilson is autocephalic and the Ecumenical Patriarch also. As far as autocephaly, he doesn't recognize it. So for him, the Ecumenical Patriarch, in his mind, the OCA is still canonically subject to the Moscow Patriarch, I would suppose, because you have to be under someone, and he doesn't claim that the OCA is under him. But maybe Representative Wilson knows something we don't. Maybe he knows that the Ecumenical Patriarch will, in short order, be formally recognizing the OCA as the canonical autocephalous Church of America. In any case, it would be interesting to learn, therefore, what Mr. Wilson is referring to in this, quote, alignment of the OCA with the Ecumenical Patriarch, end quote. The OCA emphatically supports the Ukrainian Orthodox Church led by Metropolitan Arseniy, who was stripped of his Ukrainian citizenship this year, and whom the Ecumenical Patriarch since 2019 no longer recognizes as the head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and Metropolitan of Kiev. Metropolitan Tikhon, the head of the OCA, in fact made a significant visit to Ukraine in 2024 to strengthen ties with and support the persecuted church led by Metropolitan Arseniy. But back to the main point. Joe Wilson really focused in on ROCOR and doubled down in his follow-up posts that ROCOR is just an extension of Moscow intelligence. We'll get into the statements made by ROCOR's synod and their hierarchs, but I think a little background about ROCOR would help dispel Representative Wilson's accusations. ROCOR was established by ethnic Russians who left everything over 100 years ago and fled the Russian Empire during and after the Bolshevik Revolution, specifically to preserve the faith and their identity from the influence of the Soviet government, particularly from the secret police and intelligence services, whether it was the Cheka, the NKVD, OGPU, MGB, MVD, KGB, BDB, right? Or the FSB, which is the current intelligence service. The entire premise and principle and reason for establishing ROCOR was to remain independent from government influence. And so ROCOR was canonically and Eucharistically not in communion with the Moscow Patriarchate from 1927 until 2007. 2007 was less than 20 years ago. Less than 20 years ago, ROCOR re-established canonical relations with the Moscow Patriarchate, which means that they commemorate the Patriarch of Moscow as the head of the church during services, just like the Catholics commemorate the Pope throughout the entire world, but that doesn't make them clandestine agents of the Vatican. Nobody from the Moscow Patriarchate, including Patriarch Kirill, is a member of the ROCOR Synod, which is their governing body. So ROCOR doesn't operate, quote, under the structure of Patriarch Kirill, or, quote, under the umbrella of the Moscow Patriarchate, end quote. But just to prove the point that ROCOR is not an extension of Russian intelligence, nor do they support the war in Ukraine, let's go over some statements made by ROCOR's Synod and their hierarchs. On February 22nd, 2022, 2 days before the war began, a statement by the ROCOR bishops of Europe was written. It states, quote, "We, the bishops of the Russian Church abroad in Europe, are following with sadness and deep concern the events unfolding in eastern Ukraine. Conflicts between peoples by force of arms invariably cause great suffering among the innocent, especially children and the elderly, and bring with them division, one-sidedness, and enmity. Our church in her prayer and ministry has long united Ukrainians, Russians, Belarusians, and representatives of other peoples." Later it continues, quote, "It is not possible simply to agree blindly with the one-sided picture of current events portrayed by Western sources of information. Events in these places, we know, are much more complex. not daring to assume the role of judges, but rather fulfilling our calling as humble servants of the Church, we earnestly pray for the softening of hearts, and at the same time for wisdom to be granted to all those who are now directly responsible for the fate of the peoples in Europe, including both Ukraine and Russia." End quote. Again, we'll highlight that this statement was made 2 days before the war began. On March 3rd, 2022, Metropolitan Mark, who became the acting head of ROCOR following the repose of Metropolitan Ilarion in 2022, stated the following, quote, "We, the hierarchs of the Russian Church abroad in Europe, published a statement on February 22nd. On that day, we were not yet as struck as we are now by the march of the Russian army through Ukraine. I myself grew up in the final years of the Second World War, and many of you have witnessed other wars, and so feel how much this affects us personally. We should greatly fear that Orthodox Slavs are now shooting at Orthodox Slavs. We cannot approve of any military interventions." End quote. Metropolitan Mark continued by calling the faithful to assist Ukrainian refugees any way they can and to collect funds for humanitarian aid for the suffering people of Ukraine. ROCOR, in fact, more than any other Orthodox jurisdiction, has constantly raised funds for humanitarian aid for refugees and those suffering in Ukraine since the beginning of the war to this very day. In an interview in May 2022, Metropolitan Mark, when asked, "What is your view of the war in Ukraine?" responded, quote, "I consider this war a crime. Some people believe that it has actually lasted 8 years, and that it was, for example, a mistake by the Ukrainian government to ban the use of Russian in schools. That probably is the case, but this can never be the justification for war. Absolutely not." End quote. When asked, quote, "Should the Russians withdraw from Ukraine?" he responded, quote, "Is that even a question? Yes, definitely, and completely." End quote. In June 2022, Bishop Job of Stuttgart said in an interview, quote, "The Russian Orthodox Church abroad is an autonomous part of the Russian Orthodox Church, and also has a naturally different attitude due to the fact that it is located abroad. We can commemorate the Patriarch of Moscow in our services to express the unity of the Russian Church. However, this shouldn't be confused with political support or support for his personal position. We don't agree on all points with the position of the Patriarch, but there are some misrepresentations of the positions of the Patriarch in the Western media." Later, he continued, quote, "The Patriarch places the current war in Ukraine in the context of a cultural struggle between East and West, and in particular a struggle between Eastern and Western values. In doing so, he is dragging the Church itself into this conflict, and we can't endorse that." End quote. The Chancellor of ROCOR, Archpriest Serafim Gan, writing in response to a 2023 article titled "Putin's Useful Priests," said, quote, "ROCOR has nothing to do with what the authors describe as a network of pro-Kremlin support across the West. Nor do we support the war in Ukraine. Our church is apolitical. Our communities are diverse, and a great many of our parishioners are Ukrainians. At every church service we pray for peace in the Ukraine, and do all that we can to provide material aid to Ukrainian refugees and to the suffering people in Ukraine. We are a peace-loving church and seek to place our attention on Christ our God and to serve our neighbors." End quote. Bishop Irenei of London is quoted saying in March 2022 that the war is, quote, "unwanted and utterly lamentable," end quote, noting that his diocese, quote, "abhors violence and warfare and explicitly prays and works for the immediate end of the unjust bloodshed taking place in Ukraine," end quote. In September 2023, he published a video which seems to summarize the situation today nicely. He says, quote, "Since we note with sorrow that some in the media persist in misrepresenting our views with no attempt to speak directly with us at any stage, we restate here what we have openly said since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. We stand wholly against the war and we call for it to end. I do not know how one can be clearer than this. The war is an evil. It cannot be justified. God will bless the peacemakers, as the Lord himself says. In the church we are not politicians. We in the church abroad are not linked with any state or government, nor any political ideology, as some in the media are nevertheless swift to assume. Indeed, there is something of a witch hunt on in certain circles at this moment, in which anyone can be claimed to be politically aligned this way or that, assigned as such simply by accusation, generally in a manner that serves the political interests of the one doing the quote-unquote reporting, rather than having any bearing on reality. But this leads to falsehoods, and too often, these bring real harm to those striving to live peacefully and do their part in bringing peace to terrible situations, who are wrongly accused of supporting wars they do not support or encouraging regimes with which they in fact have no connection. A tree should be judged by its fruits. Since the war began, I and my brother bishops in Europe have stood against it wholeheartedly and vocally. We have built upon this stance with action. We have already stated many times that the military actions in Ukraine are wrong. We also have stated that the persecution of prayerful Christians within Ukraine is wrong. While for some this might raise the uncomfortable reality that things are not always black and white, since the present situation implicates actors on all sides in the current war, in acts that are wrong and from which the innocent must be protected. Yes, we wrote against the persecution of Orthodox Christians in Ukraine by civil authorities, a reality that is well documented and against which there has been calls raised by religious leaders all across the world. Just as we wrote earlier against the bloodshed and killing of our Ukrainian brethren by those attacking their land from without. Let me repeat once more for the sake of clarity. Our church abroad is not united to any state, is not aligned with any government, and does not bow to or toe the line for any political agenda. Claims otherwise may arise out of ignorance or willful misrepresentation, but in any case, they are false. I mean, look, even Grok and ChatGPT say that ROCOR is not an agent of Russian intelligence. And speaking of AI search engines, ask any of them about the case with Metropolitan Arseniy or the persecution of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church by the Ukrainian government. This is publicly available information. Unless Grok, ChatGPT, and Gemini are all part of a Russian intelligence operation too. In conclusion, I want to reiterate that ROCOR was established 100 years ago, really with the sole purpose of preserving the Orthodox Christian faith and culture from the influence of the Soviet government. So accusing ROCOR of being an extension of Russian intelligence is so offensive to everything ROCOR stood and stands for, to the sacrifices made by those who left Russia and went into exile, and to the descendants of those people today who continue to uphold that zeal for the true faith. And besides that, ROCOR published a lengthy statement earlier this year that outright accuses the Russian government of reviving the terrible ideologies of the 20th century, and that if this should continue, they, quote, fear that modern Russia risks being considered a dark stain among the nations, end quote. I do believe that the statements made recently by our congressmen are done out of ignorance rather than malice, but these narratives, that are easily dispelled by a quick internet search, are also genuinely dangerous. And as they were made publicly for all to see, they should be recanted publicly as well. Thank you for your attention to this matter.